ago, they said all my scab problems are going to be on the east side of the state. Guess what? I have not found a scab problem on the east side of the state. It's always been on the west side. So there are some very interesting things that are occurring in my world, and you don't want to hear me say that since I do like diseases and I do like to see how we can help manage them. So with that, alright. Today's presentation, I'm going to start from the bare bones. I'm going to give you everything you need to know about the causal agent, Fusarium graminearum, and why we know more about that, how we can manage it not only in dry land but also in the irrigated production systems. When it comes to scab research on the irrigated ground, there's not much out there, but I'll give you a little bit of a snapshot of what we do know specifically. First thing that we need to know is Fusarium graminearum is the primary agent, and the one thing about Fusarium graminearum is that it has several host crops. It can be a disease causing Fusarium head blight in wheat, winter wheat, durum, barley, rye, and oat, but also survives saprophytically. What that means is think of it like mushrooms on a log. It can colonize host tissue. A prime example of this is what we see in corn. It can cause stalk rots and root rots and ear rots, and oftentimes it moves in after the plant's been compromised. And this photo here is an example of a typical stalk rot. Now this is under drought stress, and this pathogen moved in. Now why this comes into play is if you have a lot of Fusarium overwintering on corn, think about if corn residue compared to wheat residue. What do you think would hold more spores as far as a pathogen? Something like corn or something like wheat? Right? It's going to be corn. And in some cases, they can have 8 times more spore load than what you can have in wheat. So it's a very important concept to know that we have Fusarium in this state, and I don't think we're going to get rid of the inoculum anytime too soon. Okay? But the bigger thing is how we can start limiting the risk factors that we have when it comes to Fusarium head blight in the state. So here's the disease triangle. I know there's going to be a lot of eye rolls here. I know Cameron back here probably took this 10 years ago maybe in plant pathology. Very simple concept, but I'm going to change it into how we think of it in Fusarium head blight. So we have the pathogen source. As I mentioned, it can overwinter on corn residue. It can overwinter on small grain residue. You see all those little black pepper grain dots here? That's what's holding these spores, and they're just kind of waiting until the next spring to start releasing. Now these spores release at all times if they have the right environmental conditions. It's not always just that heading. As far as our host, we have susceptible hosts. Durum, unfortunately, is probably our most susceptible small grain host we have in the state. When you think of it in spring wheat, there's some more available resistance, and I'll kind of touch on that later. The primary driving factor of this disease is the environment. This pathogen loves persistent moisture, high humidity, and what I call its sweet spot for temperature is 75 to 85. Certainly it can infect outside that norm, but it's just kind of a good standard. And when you think of rain, you think of that as the primary moisture source. But oftentimes, what you have to remember is dew points. Anytime you have prolonged dew points, I know in some cases you can walk out into the fields at 11 in the morning, almost till noon, you can still get your pants wet. You know there's a lot of available moisture there. And anything that's it's underneath the canopy, think of all that residue that's holding the spores, it's probably loving life. So it's always going to be producing spores. So how does this look in real time? As I mentioned, these spores are being released throughout the season. Where it comes most important for Fusarium head blight is when our wheat and barley crop is out heading. Okay? That is the time it's going to infect. From barley, it infects as soon as you have a full head all the way to the soft dough. From wheat, same thing, from head to soft dough. But the most opportunistic time for when the pathogen wants to colonize these dead flowers is when you start seeing that early flowering. And one thing that I do have to point out is when it comes to environmental conditions, it's very important when the crop is heading, but it's also equally as important 14 days leading up to that. The reason being is that we call it like priming the pump like on a lawnmower. You need this pathogen source to keep being able to condition itself so it can release spores throughout the season. So if it's already had that ample moisture prior to heading, there's enough spores floating around in here. There's probably more spores than stars in the universe, okay, because they're so microscopic. So when you have that going, and you still have the prolonged wet period at heading, that is when we start having the problems with scab. Okay, so that's where it comes full circle. So as a plant pathologist, the next thing we have to know is how do we identify it? Well, for this disease, unlike foliar diseases, once you identify in your field, there's no management practice. But it can give you an idea of which fields may be more severely affected than others. Here's a picture of a durum crop here. The very typical symptom you see is the bleaching. Sometimes it's half the head, maybe it's only one little floret. It can be really variable. When it comes to barley, it's not nearly as pronounced. Here I highlighted the two kernels that are infected with Fusarium. You see more of a water-soaking, brown type of kernel, and because of some of the available host resistance in barley, you don't see that widespread infection up and down the spike. At the end of the day, what have we dealt with? Yes, scab is a yield robber, and it can drastically reduce yields. Not always, like this year being the example where we still had some good yields and still had scab problems. But really when it comes to plague where we start having problems is what we deal with the mycotoxin it produces. So the key thing to remember is if you have Fusarium head blight, you're more than likely going to have some dawn problems. That's something to always remember. They just don't manifest out anywhere. And the one thing about, I just want to touch on early season versus late season infections. During early season infections, when you have the whole spike compromised by the scab fungus, that is when you're going to see a yield loss. You're going to see these scabby kernels, those chalky white and red tombstones. That's what we're typically going to expect. When you have a later season infection, you may not see as much yield loss. The reason being is that kernel set has already filled, and all the scab fungus is doing is sitting on the surface of that seed. Okay, it's still growing, it's still producing mycotoxin. So one question I got this year is I had a 70 bushel durum crop, but I have 8 parts per million of Don. What happened? This is a perfect example of what could have happened, meaning that these spores came in later on during that end of close to grain fill, sat on the kernel, started releasing the mycotoxins due to the conducive environment. So there's so many different types of situations that we have these problems, but still the one thing that we want to know at the end of the day is how do we manage it, right? So those are my big preambles. How are we going to manage scab? I can't tell you that I have a silver bullet for scab. If I can control the environment, then I would not be here. It would be probably making millions of dollars in some royalties or something like that. But I don't have that ability. But what I'm going to do is give you a set of tools how we can limit that risk. How can we do our best putting our front foot forward in managing scab? I'm going to touch on cultural practices first, and then I'm going to go into fungicides, and then looking at varieties, and at the end bring it with an integrated approach. Now, I don't have any hard research on this, but I want to kind of just take you through the process of what are we doing with some of these practices. First thing I'm going to touch on is crop rotation. Avoiding a small grain on small grain or small grain on corn is going to reduce the amount of infield inoculum, or those spores in the canopy. Now these spores can travel miles, but your greatest risk is when those spores don't have to travel very far to infect a crop. So when you do a crop rotation, very good practice. Not only does it help for scab, but also some of these foliar diseases that we commonly occur each year. Residue management, and when I call it residue management, some people call it tillage. I've gotten questions about burning residue, about eliminating residue by baling it and removing it from a field. Regardless of any types of those residue management type of practices, the key thing what you're trying to do is the same thing, essentially is crop rotation, is reducing that infield source of inoculum. Okay, you can always help the field that you're working with. Always multiple planting dates. If you have multiple planting dates, it's not putting all your eggs in one basket. If you're a gambling individual, you could get everything done in a short time range, and then if you avoid the scab risk when it's heading out, it's great. But unfortunately, if you have high scab risk during that time that's associated with the planting, your whole crop could be under a higher level of scab. Now, if you do vary it even just a week in the differences, you can see some scab differences in that alone. I've had numerous examples from growers saying, I planted some stuff that was a week before or other, and that's worse off than others. Why is that? So it reflects to what type of environment did you have at heading and then flowering. Because a lot of that's probably the most important thing to consider. Why, if you have multiple planting dates, you may take a hit on one field, but most of the other fields are going to be okay. Not exactly, a clean, 100% way of managing it, but just one idea to consider. One thing I want to touch on is water use, and this is probably the only thing I have on irrigation today. Tyler, sorry to say there's not much out there when it comes to irrigated scab work, but it really comes down to water use at heading. Everything that's been done is, so what they say is shut off the sprinklers when the crop is heading. Okay, that makes sense from a lot of reasons. You avoid that microclimate, the moisture retention on the heads, which you control it that way, you can reduce the amount of scab pathogen infection events. And kind of a good example of it is available water. That's when the pathogen is going to be loving life at that point. So those are the type of cultural practices and what they do. At NDSU, most of our research is geared on the host side and also the how can we best use our fungicides, and that's where most of my message on that is going to be heavily influenced on today. So beginning with less susceptible varieties. What I put up here is 3 market classes in the small grains, and I just want to give you the story of where we're at for resistance. In the hard red wheats, spring wheats and winter wheat, all of our resistance that's currently available is FHB1. It's derived from an ancient germplasm in China known as the Sumai 3. And really, the thing to remember is this is not complete resistance. This is not immunity. This isn't you getting a shot in your arm and you're sick and you feel great. No, this is what we call partial resistance. It's better than the rest. You may still see scab infection when you have really high scab risk years, but it is definitely a step in the right direction. Barley, as I mentioned in that photo, notice I said that they don't have the typical bleaching of the spike up and down. Well, this has to do with what we call natural type 2 resistance. Okay, that doesn't mean much to you. So what does type 2 resistance mean is you have an initial infection, but it doesn't spread up and down the rachis. So when we say it has natural type 2, most of the times you only see a kernel, maybe 2 here or there. You don't see it up and down that whole wheat head. Durum, we have much less resistance. In 2016, after talking to our breeder, I was able to, I don't know if this is an accomplishment or what it is, but we lowered our scab resistance ratings to identify that we do not have resistant durum out there. At best, what I call it is moderate resistance, meaning that there's some better than the rest, but I would equate the best durum variety to about a moderate susceptible spring wheat variety. So that's just something I really want everybody to know is that when you deal with durum, anytime we deal with resistance, it's only relative to what you're dealing with in that market class, and it's not spread out across like spring wheat. There's just not much available out there. And all the screening efforts that I've done and all the germplasm and even trying to incorporate into resistance genes, oftentimes they could get something that looks good for scab, but then the quality was sacrificed when it comes to the durum. So that's where we're at with the durum. And it's just something to remember, if you do grow durum, yes, there is a risk reward. The risk being that it could be more scab risk, but the reward is you might be able to get a better price for it if you're able to get it to market. So show you an example of what we have for variety susceptibility. So I want to show you a site that we had. This is a winter wheat site we had looking at variety by fungicide. On the vertical axis we have the parts per million of Dawn, meaning at the end of the year we took all these samples from these varieties. We had that Dawn analyzed, and on the bottom we have all the winter wheat varieties that were tested. This was done with Joel Ransom, our extension agronomist out in Fargo. And I'm not going to go step by step here, but I do want to show you that there is quite a bit of variability in our varieties. Specifically in winter wheat, a couple varieties that have been looking really good lately is AC Emerson and Lyman. Both those consistently have a lower response to come to Dawn at the end of the year, and it's something to know that yes, there are some very good varieties. But the other gamut on this, if you know winter wheat, is survival. Fortunately, these two varieties don't survive as well as like the decade and cherry that we have. So there's that trade-off. So like I said, it's always I call it the idealistic and realistic. Ideally, we have some good varieties in winter wheat. Realistically, I don't know if anyone wants to deal with the unevenness that you'll see in a field with it. And that's just, I guess that's my 2 cents on that. When we look at durum, the same type of concept. This is done with Shayna over in Minot. And this is just going to show you that when it comes to durum susceptibility, there are some better than others. So Normano, it's not really grown here. It's kind of a high specialty durum. Really high Dawn levels. I picked Carpio, Drop, and Divide. Certainly have lower down levels, right? But we're still dealing with 12 to 16 part per million durum, right? It's still not giving the answer. But in a situation, say we didn't have as high as a scab risk year, we were able to lower that just based on variety selection. That's when it really comes into play. So when it comes to varieties, we have variety selection guides out there with the tools. Remember that there's much more available resistance in the spring wheats, but there are some durum varieties better than the rest. And, you know, some are worse too, but I mean, it's just something to keep in mind when it comes to durum. And winter wheat, like I said, it's becoming a less and less growing crop across the state. You can contract the acreage since about 3 years ago. But there are some winter wheat varieties out there that do have some available scab resistance. Anybody have any questions on varieties before I go into fungicides? Yes?
Have you noticed any relationship between maturity and scab?
So the question is regards to seeing a relationship between maturity, as in days ahead or days to...
You know how long it takes to be done with
Okay.
flowering and...
Okay, so you take those flowering aspects, you take into the days ahead and the scab. I think the varieties that tend to flower longer, you generally see a little bit more scab risk with them. I had one grower tell me in the Williston area, they said that his durum felt like it flowered for 2.5 weeks this year. You know, so that's something that certain varieties you can see a higher risk with that. But at the end of the day, the environment, when that's heading and flowering is often what we see as being the bigger driver. But certainly anything that flowers a little bit longer, you might see a greater risk for scab being able to infect. Any other questions on varieties? Tyler?
Not variety, going back to your residue, just so like you could explain, like you're talking in the corn and in this residue, how long does that stuff stay? I mean, is it going to stay in the residue? And like the second part of that is like this cold weather. Is there anything with that that's helping us right now?
That's two great questions. So Tyler's asking on the pathogen biology more or less is how well does it how long it can overwinter on residue, and also what does the environment do to survival. So when it comes to residue, this pathogen can survive 2 to 3 years pretty comfortably when residue is left on the soil, right? But after that first year, the amount of spores almost gets cut in half. Does that make sense? So the longer it's surviving there, the less chance it has to produce spores. So when it comes to how long in your field, probably expect 2 to 3 years. So that's where rotation comes in. But as I mentioned, what you're doing in your field, maybe across the road, may be a completely different story. So there's always a scab type of inoculum source. And don't think of it as that your neighbor's creating problems for you, but it's just the dynamic of this disease. The pathogen can survive everywhere. Now when it comes to what does environmental conditions do, it has a great winter jacket. It can survive our winters. It's been surviving here since back in the early 1900s when they started documenting scab. So really, environment doesn't have much to do with it. And actually, there's more snow cover you have on it. It's like anything, it's an insulating layer too. But two very good questions. I mean, this pathogen is very adapted. It likes our state. It's here to stay.
What about alternate residue like soybeans? Does that break up the non-cycle at all?
Yep, good question. So the question pertains to other types of crops in the rotation. So what I consider non-hulls, a lot of your broadleaves, so your soybeans and dry beans. Certainly graminearum can survive on some of the pulse crops, some of the root rots. I know they've been isolating some Fusarium graminearum from that, but it's not as high as a potential as like cereal residue is. So any type of crop rotation, I mean, it just come really into play not only for scab and avoiding on corn and the wheat on wheat type of production practices.
So tillage versus non-tillage. So, you know, you get done with your corn, you go in, you disc rip it versus not. Does it survive longer in the soil, when the residue in the soil, or less?
So the question pertains to tillage and the survival of this pathogen. So anytime you incorporate residue into the soil and it has, with the pathogen, so think of it that corn residue when it had those black pepper grains on it, you till that into the soil. Not only you're breaking up that residue as it's going into the soil, where it's going to decrease the chance of that pathogen using that as a food source, but you have all those beneficial soil microbes. They're also decomposing that residue over time. And that's lowering your risk of scab. And the other thing too is if you get these fruiting bodies below the soil, they can't geyser up. I mean, that's the physical barrier to prevent it. Is it 100% effective? No. I mean, it's not going to get rid of your scab problems, but tillage is one thing that got heavily employed after the bad scab epidemics of the 93 to 97 on the east side, is the amount of tillage that rose just to help reduce some of the residue. Not always the most practical for everybody when it comes to the production practice, though.
Right, so that'll suppress it, but will it, is it still just sitting there waiting to come back to the surface next time you work the ground?
So that's a great question. So regarding to once you work the ground, maybe bring the residue back up. If it's hardy enough, like going back to Tyler's question, it can last for 2 to 3 years. It can go dormant. So when you bring it back up to the soil surface, it's not going to be as what I call youthful in a sense as it would be just sitting there year after year, but it still has a chance of releasing spores. Any other questions on that?
Any idea on how much infection is caused by the spores that are on the residue of that existing crop, and how much infection comes in windblown?
Another very good question. As far as spore sources, is it more, percentage-wise, what is more likely from within the field than from something coming in and out? I don't have a hard answer for you on percentages, but I always think, what's the path of least resistance? If you have that residue, say if it's corn residue and you put wheat into it, and the spores are getting released, it doesn't have to travel very far for it to infect a head. Or if it's coming from another field, you get a couple updrafts, you get some other physical barriers, it's less likely, but it still can be a source. So anything within your field is definitely a greater risk of inciting infections, but that being said, there's several examples where you may not have put wheat on any type of cereal crop for 3 years and still have a scab problem. So I mean that there's still an abundance of inoculum floating when the environment is conducive for it. So it's a good question, but as far as percentages, I just treat it as, it will help, but it's not going to cure it. Any more on cultural varieties or anything like that before fungicides? Okay, these are good questions. I like this. This is great. When it comes to fungicide management, I'm going to touch this on a few different angles. One is scab forecasting models, and I'm going to tell you the limitations and the pros of it. And I'm going to tell you about what we can do as far as fungicide selection and then timing. Now, when it comes to scab forecasting models, there are 2 available we have. They do have different algorithms, but they're really heavily driven on relative humidity values. The one that we have in North Dakota, the small grain forecasting website, is more of what I call the day-late type of approach. It always takes the weather data from the previous day, and it gives you that scab risk based off yesterday's assessments. When it comes to the national model, it can give you scab estimations 3 days in advance. So that's one big difference between it. As far as the variables, as I mentioned, relative humidity is big. For the small grain disease forecasting model, it takes those values 14 days prior to your date you selected for heading, whereas the national model is 7. That's kind of a minor adjustment. They work in the same way, meaning that if you select your location nearest to you, and you look at the maps, red means high, yellow means moderate, and green means low. Okay, so now I want to show you what would happen this past year. And this is going to start in June 15th, and I picked June 15th because this is when I felt that we started getting a lot of rain up in this area of the world, and it seemed like it was raining every other day. So if it rained, say if we're sitting June 15th and we had a lot of rain yesterday, well, it's not going to reflect as being high scab risk the next day. But over time, you can see pockets develop. So if I fast forward to 2 weeks, you can start seeing what I call these scab pockets starting to emerge on the northern side of North Dakota. And as July 5th and then July 19th, you can kind of see where we're at. And a lot of this is really tracked on the amount of rainfall. Now, I want to draw your attention to 2 areas that I felt the model did a very poor job of predicting scab this year. Okay? Look at that, right? So the question is, why is that? Well, there are some limitations to this model. This gives us a good estimation of what's occurring out there, but our data is only as good as where we're retrieving the weather from. And I've lived in this state my whole life, and I've seen it rain when it's sunny out, and I've seen differences in rainfall patterns from 2 inches to a tenth if you go less than a mile. Okay, So if you think of that concept, and you think of where our weather stations are positioned, that's something you have to keep in mind. Always think of where you're at. If you've had more rain, if you've had more relative humidity or more dew in the canopy, the gut instinct tells you that your scab risk is going to be a little bit higher. Especially if we start looking to the neighbors up in Divide County. I saw some laughs, so I'm guessing I circled maybe something in maybe Ray, Tioga area too, right? And that's just kind of where we're at. So what are we going to do? Well, right now, I know we're in early works of getting another end-on location near the Ray area. I know Audrey and I were in conversations too to maybe get one up by, we could even go up by Zoll, you know, in one case. Might be a good location just to give us a better perception of and putting more weather data into it to make it a more useful tool. So that's it. I want to be upfront. There are limitations to it. Okay, this isn't the surefire way saying there's going to be a scab problem here each and every year based off these models. It's always an estimation, and it's only as good as the weather data that we have. More weather stations we have, probably the better the model is going to be at the end of the day. But don't underestimate that gut instinct, what I refer to it. If you feel uncomfortable, especially over the past 3 years, we've had scab problems up here. If you're uncomfortable with what the weather is showing out there, I think your decision to spray is kind of telling you. There's no model that's going to override what you're thinking at that point. So if you are going to spray, first thing I have to preach to this, because they did a national survey where there are still some fungicides that are being put out there that are not effective on scab and actually are hurting you. And I'm going to put this in bold. It's kind of obnoxious, but I just want to drive home this point. Do not use strobilurins for scab management. So what are strobilurins? These are the headlines, the quadruses. Don't use the mixes, the quilts, the priaxers. That just doesn't work. When you use that strobilurin, it's been well documented that sometimes your DON levels could actually increase at the end of the year. So there's something to avoid completely is do not spray anything that has FRAC 11 on it. The only fungicide class that we have are solo triazole products. And with these products, what I'm going to highlight in this table, there are efficacy differences amongst them. So this table is generated in part with the U.S. Wheat and Barley Scab Initiative that's been around for over 20 years now. And this is across hundreds and hundreds of trials all over the U.S. And what we're looking at is the relative efficacy or effectiveness of Fusarium, Caramba, Proline, Folicare, and the generics. There's a bunch out there, Tilt, and the generics. And I'm going to separate these into what I call tiers. And this is just based off its efficacy at reducing scab severity in the field and DON suppression. Okay? So if we look at Fusarium, Caramba, and Proline, at best, when I look at the DON levels, you're looking somewhere in the 40%. I would actually raise that a little bit up in this area. I say we're about a 50%, maybe 50% effectiveness when it comes to applying these fungicides. So first thing, is this 100% control? No. And unfortunately, there's nothing in the pipeline that I see coming. I get asked that question, I'll get pulled aside. Hey, what's coming? Is there a new tool? I don't have any optimism at this point. What we do have is we have the triazoles. We do know that there are some better than the rest. If you look at the Folicare generics, on this DON it says down to 23% of suppression. I'd raise this to about 30 is what I call it, just based on the data we've had over the last couple of years. And as far as Tilt, the generics, the propiconazole, the bumper, I can't remember all the generics that are out there right now. They're really good foliar products. They're really great at that early season herbicide time and suppressing some of those diseases. But for scab, I don't put a lot of weight on them. There's definitely better chemistries out there within that triazole class that can help you. So, knowing that we need to spray a triazole, probably the next question that's often referred as the $1 million question of scab is timing. When do I go out there? What's the best time to apply? Okay, so the two general recommendations is, I say this is almost too sciencey all the time, is that 80% of the field is at early flowering for wheat or full head for barley. How I translate that is when most of your field is at early flowering or is at full head for barley. So the first thing to identify is what is early flowering in wheat and in durum. Well, this is when you start seeing the production of these yellow flowers in the middle of the head. Okay, that's the beginning of early flowering. Certainly once that starts to when it gets rid of its flowers, it could be 3 to 7 days. that is what we're targeting. Why? If you remember, the scab fungus will take those flowers, infect it, and that is its infection core to spreading in the head. So I just highlighted to show you an example of what we look like in the field. I understand there's variability in the field. I understand that some stuff could be headed and some stuff is just reaching boot, right? I understand that. That happens. So when it comes to making an application, use your best judgment when you know that most of your field is at early flowering, is going out there making that scab application. Give me an example of some early flowering, post flowering. At post flowering, that's when they start turning white, they kind of die, and they fall to the ground. And the reason why that's important is you'll see as some of the studies we've been working on, looking at fungicide timing, is when I say early flowering and post flowering, that's what I'm referring to. For barley, I have 3 different stages here. The best time to make an application for barley is at full head. Now, one question I often get is, why do we target the full head? Why not? Can we put a fungicide on there at flag leaf and get the suppression? One thing to remember about fungicides, they're not fully systemic. They're not like a glyphosate in the herbicide world. They're only as good as what you cover them, or what you're able to cover. When you think of scab, you have a moving target to begin with, right? It's not like a leaf. What do you get more coverage when you're spraying a fungicide? Leaf's going to catch a lot of things. That's why when you spray for scab, you do get some flag leaf control just based off gravity. When it comes to scab, getting as much coverage on that head is so important because the fungicide it can only move so far. It's not going to go fully systemic. So anytime you make that fungicide application out there, understand that. Hence why we always recommend angled nozzles to make that application, so you can increase the coverage that you have on that head. A regular flat fan nozzle positioned vertically down is not going to give you as much coverage as if you have an angled nozzle head. Question?
What about aerial then for scab suppression?
Another good question. So the question refers to on aerial application versus, I'll just compare aerial versus ground. I didn't dedicate a slide to it, but aerial application does work. But our recommendations is try to get that water up to 5 gallons per acre. And there's going to be a lot of, I ask for 5, I get 1, type of thing. I understand that. If you choose aerial application, the more water you have, the better coverage you have. And as I just mentioned with the fungicides, if you think of it that way, that's where it's your best friend. With ground application, I would say you have your ability to control how much water is out there. Certainly it might take a few more time. You may not be equipped with it. But if I have a choice between, if I can make either a ground or aerial application, I tend to always recommend a ground application knowing that you have more coverage. But not to say that aerial application can still work, but it's really important to get as much water as you can out there with it to increase your coverage. So when we make these fungicide recommendations, where are we at right now? So I want to show you some data on single fungicide timings. This is done up in Langdon on the Durum trial, the last 14 and 15. We compared no fungicide, so nothing sprayed, on Montreal and Divide. A fungicide sprayed at early flowering, this time was Fusarium, and then a single fungicide of Fusarium 5 days after flowering. Okay, so we're just looking at single timings of a fungicide application. So this is what we call our standard when no fungicide is put on this trial. Certainly you have some variety susceptibility between Montreal and Divide. So that's what we begin with. So what does an early flowering application do? Well, knocks it down by 50 to 60%. But one thing I really get asked questions on is, should I be too early or too late, right? So this post-flowering is really dictating being too late in this case. We're starting to see a trend, not in just this trials, but I mean over the last 3 years, is coming in a little bit later is better than being too early, but also in some cases you're able to get as much scab suppression as that one time at early flowering. So when I think of this data, I tell people, still target early flowering as your time when you want to get out there, but say if you're a couple of days late, that's okay too. The reason behind this, maybe some of those tillers are coming up a little bit later, you're catching some of that at the flowering time, or maybe even the scab risk window is a little bit higher at post-flowering. So there's a little bit what I call is opening up on the back end of fungicide timing for scab, and it's something that I think should be considered for the next couple of years, and we'll continue to be doing the research. For barley, this is kind of the same thing I want to show you. These are dawn levels at a couple different fungicide timings. The first one, this is your non-treated, not very high dawn levels to begin with, so this is about 1.8 parts per million. When Carumba, Fusarium, Muscle is a tebuconazole, a foliar generic compound. You're able to reduce it some. And then the last two I want to bring attention is Carumba and Fusarium, 5 days late, so to speak. You're still able to get some dawn suppression. So it's not just in durum, it's just not in spring wheat, it's also in barley. It's this new mentality that we're starting to see is that scab window is starting to open up on the back end of it. One question that we started exploring this year is what I call the double split applications, coming in at, say, at head or at early flowering and coming back 5 days later. Audrey hosted some of the trials up here this year. Across the state, we had 12 trials across 5 locations, multiple collaborative effort. What I'm doing is giving you a summary table of what we found. So on this table, I'm going to give you a fungicide, the timing that it was applied, and how well it reduced dawn. So this is what I call our standard treatment of Fusarium at 6.5 ounces at early flowering. We're looking at dawn reduction across all market classes at 44%. This next combination, I don't consider it economical. I will mention that some of these are not the most economic, but it was a question that we need to answer. If we put our best 2 products out there, how much scab suppression can we get? So this is Fusarium at early flowering, followed by Carumba 4 to 7 days later, depending on location. It bumped up to about 64%. Still not 100%, I understand that. Carumba at early flowering with the tebuconazole, 58%. And I think this is something that's starting to get used a little bit more in the double application. And the other one was Proline at early flowering, and then tebuconazole later, about 64%. So what are some of the trends we saw? Doing a double application did reduce that dawn level a little bit more, but the next question I need to analyze this data is how does this pan out in the economics? You know, going out there a second time, adding that extra cost of another fungicide, where does that sit? And I don't have that economic analysis done yet. And that's something that we're going to work on. We're doing these trials again across all 12 locations, so the 12 trials across 5 locations. So we'll have over 20 trials of data on this next year, and hopefully, I think Audrey has agreed to put it on her most scab-prone ground, right? So we can get some really good data. But we're really going to develop on this, and the next aspect is doing the economic analysis of whether or not this is going to pencil out. A couple final thoughts on management. Our best source right now is, you kind of saw this previously, is integrated management. That is, in this case, using your best varieties, using a well-timed fungicide, using that crop rotation. Really try to throw as many curveballs at the pathogen as you can. In this case, this is a hard red spring wheat variety by fungicide timing trials that were conducted in 14 and 15. This is a non-treated of a susceptible and a mildly resistant as coded in the selection guide. And notice that if you apply fungicide at early flowering, or if you do that post-flowering application, you really can reduce it even more. You're better off combining the two, as your scab level suppression can be even more than just relying on one tool as deemed here. So that's just something to keep in mind is, yes, we do have some management tools, and there's nothing that's 100% effective, but we are taking a step in the right direction. The last couple comments I have is probably a very pertinent question. What do I do with all this high dawn seed? Good question. And I'm just going to touch on 3 things. One thing I say is separate it at the time. If you could, keep your good crop with your good crop and your poor crop away from it. Certainly you could do the blending game where you could try to hedge your bets, so they call, but you could it's a risk-reward type of analogy there, and you could get by with it, but at the same time you could compromise a really good seed lot. I get questions on cleaning, and cleaning can be really effective. If you do have a lot of scabby kernels, unfortunately when you have these late season infections, when you don't see those scabby kernels, they don't clean out as well, right? Because when you use those gravity tables, it's all based off kernel density. Some trials that they did based on cleaning seed, this is done a long time ago, because I think the market, they have 320 wheat in here. I think this was done about 15 years ago. But it was really showing this was a very high scab lot, at 8 parts per million of dawn. After they cleaned it out, it got down to 0 to 2 and it was able to be marketable again. Cleaning can help, but it's not always going to give you probably the best results. There could be a lot of variability with it. Depends on the type of scab infection that you have or when that pathogen came in. If you have a lot of tombstone kernels, the white chalky kernels, that's when you can really clean out and get rid of the worst and keep the best. But it's not always, may not be able to even get down to levels low enough. So that's about all I have on cleaning, but it's just something to keep in mind. Question in the back?
I've been hearing a lot on guys getting samples taken, and there must be, is there 2 or 3 different tests for testing for Don? And they're getting different numbers per test, and it's really frustrating them.
Okay, so the question is on Don testing, when you take it in, and what level is, or which one should you be trusting? When it comes to Don testing, the bigger thing to remember is all depicted on the sample. There's much more error in the sample than there is in the technology that is doing it. When they just started doing some of the assessments of variability of a Don sample across multiple technologies, your variation was like 5% maybe, somewhere in there, so very minor, as opposed to where you took the sample, it was much larger. And then how I can put that into real terms is I use the mentality that all it takes is one bad kernel to ruin a bunch. When you see those really scabby kernels in there, if that gets sampled out, those can harbor up to 270 parts per million of Don, just one kernel. So of course it's you blend it with everything else, that's how it gets reduced, but it really comes back to the sample. What I recommend, if there's anything or questions on that, I say certainly you can keep getting samples and see what your Don levels are, but try to clean it up as much as you can, just to reduce the occurrence of any of those scabby kernels. And there's always standards of end gate sampling and probing and stuff, and there's standards set by the Federal Grain Inspection Services, and they do follow all that. At the end of the day, when it comes to what about technology, if who's right or wrong, it really comes down to what sample is being pulled out of there, and whether or not there's kernels.
Yeah, because I've had some guys that have said that they say they take it to the elevator in Ray or something, and they test it, and it comes back 4. And they're happy with that. Well, then Ray must send it off to a state lab before they pay them, and they've been coming back higher then, so then these guys are getting paid less, and then they're really upset. And they're wondering why so it's just obviously in that 5-gallon bucket, there can test quite a bit different, just sampled out that one bucket.
Yeah, that's right. That's the unfortunate thing, and obviously that's a much bigger thing that I can handle, and I can even entertain questions on. But if you think of it as why we see that variability in those levels, is as soon as you pull a different sample, it's going to be a different number, just based on the biology of what we see. It's a very common question this year, and I know there's a lot of, I'll say anger. It's not even frustration. I say there's a lot of anger with it, and that's probably the best answer I have for you that I can offer.
What level can you have and still consider using it for seed the next year?
I'll touch on that next. The next thing is saving it for seed. what a convenient time. So when it comes to saving scabby seed for next year's planting, there are some risk factors, but I do know there's a lot of cases where they're able to do it and still able to get a good stand, a good crop, and nothing happens. If you plant a scabby seed, it's not going to manifest into a scabby head. That's the first thing to rule out. It's not a systemic. What this pathogen does is it can cause seedling blights and it can cause root rots. Okay, so that is where it's going to be most effective. As you can see in this photo here, I planted some scabby durum seed in the greenhouse. You see all that white fuzzy growth and red growth? That's just the Fusarium fungus that is taking as seed. Notice that it's still able to put a shoot out in the root, but this is probably going to last 2 or 3 more days before it dies. Okay. So that's the thing is what we're dealing with. So if you have high Don seed, the best thing to do is to do a germination test. What's your percent of the crop that is germinating? Okay, just like anything other do. Because sometimes you may see 70%, maybe down as low as 30%. Okay, you got to make those adjustments based on the plant population. I always recommend to clean it up too. You want to get rid of as many of those kernels as you can out of that. So you're not contributing to seeds being placed by seeds that could spread that infection of a root rot. But then, probably more importantly, they can save your bet. There are seed treatments that do a very good job of getting that plant above the ground. The wheat crop is more susceptible as it's just starting to develop to root rots, or right when it's, in this case, starting to emerge out of the ground. So if you can get that seed established, get it up out of the ground, A lot of the root rots that we see on small grains are slow colonizers. So anything that we can do to increase the plant coming up out of the ground, the better you're off. So the question is, how much dawn can I risk using it for seed? That's a tough question, because sometimes you may have a high dawn level and low scabby seeds, or you may have a low dawn level and a lot of scabby seed. So that's where you need to do that germination test to figure out what is the viability of that seed before you put it into the ground.
So
Question.
then, if you're trying to get off to a better start, if you're planting dawn or seed with dawn levels, is it better to wait till it warms up in the spring better so it comes out a lot faster than your seed sitting in the ground for 2 weeks before
Yes.
it sprouts?
So the question is, as far as seed bed prep, or when putting this into the ground, and it's a yes and no thing. I mean, yes, if you can get that crop above with all the healthy seeds above the ground quicker, that's sort of recommended. But oftentimes those conditions are sometimes conducive for the pathogen itself. But in this case, and with this pathogen system with the root rots and small grains, if you win the race with the host getting above the ground, you're oftentimes going to beat it to the finish line. Okay, so I mean, yeah, that does help. If you can get emergence quicker and doing all those necessary factors. But same day, if you're cleaning, doing the germ test, and putting a seed treatment on it, that's probably your best bet. Do I recommend it? I mean, as a pathologist, I can't, because that just contributes to putting pathogens in the soil, right? But as a standard practice, I know it's been done. When I've done trials, I've looked at scabby seed with and without seed treatment. I can see the value of the seed treatment. But even the crop that I put in the ground that was scabby, I was still able to, you know, what I consider bushel pretty well. So there's a possibility to do it. It's just something to consider. There are risk factors with it. And so if you put it into the ground, just remember that as the season progresses. Other than that, I know I'm pushing up on the time window. I tried Tyler didn't yank me from the floor here yet. As you can see, he's really concerned right now. But it's a couple of key notes that I want you guys to remember is scab is a sporadic disease. 2 of the past 3 years, we're dealing with some what I call very significant scab problems in this area of the state. But if you looked at what it was during the 2015 growing season, does anybody know where the worst scab spot in the state was in 2015? Hettinger, Southwest North Dakota. Okay, so I would say I can always guarantee, unfortunately, there's going to be a scab problem somewhere in the state, but I can never depict where it's at. And a lot of that is due to where's the weather. Where's the rain coming? When is it coming? What type of humidity levels do we have during the falling period? So that just remember, it's a very dynamic disease and responds well to the weather. As far as management, integrated management is best, but there's no silver bullet out there. Certainly using the best variety, well-timed fungicides when you're in a scab risk, and doing some of those cultural practices can reduce your scab risk, but it's never, I don't have somebody referred to it as a cure in a can. I don't have that for you. Maybe 20 years I might develop something, but that's merely hypothetical at this point. And often what I do about next year, like anything, because it's a sporadic disease, you still move forward. You know, you're not going to get rid of small grains. I mean, that just does not make any sense to me. But you will probably adjust some of the things you do. Maybe budgeting for an input of a fungicide more at early flowering, and maybe foregoing it early in the season if you do crop rotation. Those are some of the factors. And as far as a scab risk, I don't know where it's going to be at next year. Maybe it'll be cemented on Fargo again. I mean, it's really difficult to tell where scab problems are going to be. It's just something to keep in mind moving forward. So with that, I know we answered a lot of questions, but I can take 1 or 2 more, maybe?
Yeah, because you're going to be around all morning.
And I said, I'll be around if you want to corner me and want to chastise me or whatever. I mean, I'll drink enough coffee to hold my ground. So, question.
How long does the pathogen stay there? If you're going to grow durum, if you went 2 years with a broadleaf in between there, at what point does the length rotation start?
So the question goes back to rotation and how long the pathogen survives there. If the residue is kept on the soil and it's kind of just hanging out there, say if it's on wheat residue or if it's on corn residue, I say it could be up to 3 years. Certainly the most spores are produced the year after you grow a crop. But as far as rotation goes, 2 to 3 years is going to help, but it's not going to guarantee you scab free in that 3rd year because you have the other outside influences, those spores blowing into the field. So I do recommend rotation for a lot of other reasons too, because anytime you can avoid any other residue-borne diseases coming in, that helps as well. As far as longevity, I just say, scab is not, the scab fungus is not an invasive species. It's been around. It only flares its ugly head when you give it the right conditions. I mean, that's kind of how it is.
Do you think that,
So go ahead, I'll come back a
does
little bit.
the adoption of no-till, has that spurned the scab?
Oh, this is a good question. Production practice and adaptation of no-till, and it is commonly documented. Anytime you have no-till, you'll see a rise in residue-borne diseases. In the wheat world, it's sometimes we see more tan spot on no-till, wheat on wheat ground, right? Same thing with the scab fungus. You can tend to see that. Back in the 1993 to 1997, the scab epidemics on the east side, they really attributed a lot of it to the move of corn into the state and also the practices of no-till that were occurring as just contributing. They're not the say that's what I'm going to blame everything on, but it definitely can contribute to problems. I'll go over there, then I'll come back here.
So it's in the soil. Is there any data on what was going on in Saskatchewan before it flared up in North Dakota? I mean, did it come with the storms too?
Okay, so the question pertains to the problems we're having north of the border right now and how that has influenced probably some of the areas we have. The longer the spores have to be carried miles, the less viable they are. Okay, so they're not like a rust spore, for example, that can be carried thousands of miles and still be able to infect. These spores are much more sensitive to the environment. So I wouldn't say that they're being blown in from the spores, or the spores are being blown in with the systems, rather than the rain that was coming with it. It's probably just flaring the amount of Fusarium that we have in this area and causing our problems, more or less. It's a good question, because I don't even know if they're exporting any of the durum crop north of us right now. It's pretty awful. Do you have a question?
Yeah, have you seen any work on tillage by rotation? Because by incorporating the broadleaves, you'll get residue breakdown.
So the question.
Do you see that benefit of tillage go away by rotating out of small grains?
So the question pertains to any data on tillage by rotation. I can't say I know anything that's on tillage by rotation. Most of the studies that were done prior to my start were done on crop rotation or tillage, but then take both factors into consideration how well that did that. I think a lot of that too becomes with the setup of some of those trials can be very problematic. Being able to dedicate certain parts of land to no-till and till and planting different crops, but it is doable. And I don't know anything outright, especially for North Dakota. I don't know anything that's taken both factors in. Like I said, I'll be around here. I know Tyler wants to get moving on with this, but feel free to call me at any time.